Shabbat Shalom once again, everyone. As always, this evening's Friday Night Live program is a product of the Temple Emanu-El Stryker Cultural Center, and it's made possible through the generosity of the Tisch family, and my deepest thanks to them. Tonight we begin our celebration of Black History Month by welcoming one of the nation's most prolific and thoughtful writers who, at the age of 40, has already produced 5 New York Times #1 bestsellers, won the National Book Award for Nonfiction, the youngest writer ever to do so, received a MacArthur Genius Fellowship, and been named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world. You can't get tired of hearing that, right? It is so extraordinary. Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the Boston University Center for Antiracist Research, as well as a contributing writer at The Atlantic and a CBS News Justice contributor. He earned his PhD from Temple University in African American Studies in 2010 and has been welcomed as a visiting professor, fellow, and scholar at numerous other universities too. I'm truly honored to welcome Dr. Ibram X. Kendi. I have a sense, having looked at your itinerary over the past couple of weeks, of how far you've traveled around this country and how exhausting it must be, but I appreciate the commitment that you make to sharing the message that you have to teach. And I want to begin with something of an apology in advance, because if I ask any questions that don't come out exactly right, I hope you'll recognize that they come from a place of desire to learn and understand, and of deep gratitude for having the opportunity to learn from you tonight. So welcome. I want to begin with a little bit about Black History Month itself. Though its origins stretch back at least 50 years earlier, in 1976, February was established as Black History Month. And I want to know how you find meaning in it and whether you feel it accomplishes its goals.
Well, first, I just want to thank you for this conversation. I'm truly honored to be here and to be in conversation. So Black History Month originally was Negro History Week, and that week was founded in 1926 by a former school teacher who got his PhD in history from Harvard named Carter G. Woodson. And he started Black History Month because he saw that there were so many teachers, particularly Black teachers, who were trying to teach what at the time was Negro history, but they were being prevented from teaching. Books were being banned, including his books. And he really wanted to support these teachers and even promote Negro history. And so I see certainly many people who are trying to use this month to promote the teaching of African American history and awareness of African American history, and even to support educators who are trying to do so with their students. But I also see some striking similarities in this moment to what Carter G. Woodson was facing when he actually pioneered what ultimately became Black History Month.
Can you talk a little bit about those parallels?
Well, I mean, just books were being banned. You had people who were committed to white supremacy who was determining curriculums. You had teachers who weren't being empowered and allowed to tell the truth to their students. You had all sorts of attacks on history. In the 1920s, slavery was being taught as this time where money was not made and African people were happy in slavery, and then the Civil War came and one person freed the slaves, and then Reconstruction came and devastated the white South, but then the white South was redeemed by the Ku Klux Klan. That was being taught, to school children. Just as some of the stories today that are being taught to school children are not based in reality.
Okay. All right, let's get to your writing. First, an explanation of terms. What do you mean when you suggest that we should understand the word racist as a descriptive word as opposed to a pejorative word?
Well, let me just give even that question some context. So someone once stated that racist isn't a descriptive term, it's a pejorative term. It's the equivalent of saying, I don't like you. And that someone was Richard Spencer. Richard Spencer, who sort of pioneered the alt-right movement, who helped organize the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where of course people chanted, Jews will not replace us. And so that's one of the defining features of white supremacist thought, that the term racist is equivalent to attacking someone, or it's a pejorative term. And what I've shown with my work, that racist is simply a descriptive term. It describes when a person, let's say, is expressing an idea of racial hierarchy, or even supporting a policy or practice that is leading to or maintaining racial inequity or injustice.
Okay, thank you. So what is the difference between being not racist and being anti-racist?
Well, I think the most fundamental difference is that to be anti-racist is to actually have the courage and the wherewithal to admit and acknowledge the times in which we're being racist. The term not racist is, in many ways, an historical term that connects with the fact that throughout history, people who were being racist typically self-identified as not racist. They typically identified their policies, their practices, their ideas as not racist. Whether it was enslavers who were claiming that black people were the cursed descendants of Ham, or that slavery was a positive good, whether it was Jim Crow segregationists who were saying it's separate but equal down here, or even whether it's people today who are claiming that racism is a left-wing hoax, and that the problem are those people who are identifying racism. The term not racist has typically been utilized by people to just not being willing to admit actually that they said or did something that was racist. But I should also add, part of the reason why people do that is because we have been taught that racist isn't a descriptive term, and it's not even just a pejorative term, that it's an identity. Like, it is who a person essentially is. And so that's how you have people saying, like, I don't have a racist bone in my body, right? Or people don't, if they feel like if they admit that when they said black people were lazy, they were being racist, that it's not just them stating that in that moment they were being racist. They believe that they are essentially saying that that's who they are. And what I've tried to show with my work is that racist and anti-racist describe what a person is being in any given moment. These are not terms that describe who a person is, but what a person is being based on what they're doing or not doing.
And in the book, you suggest, and I think I'm remembering it right, you're one or the other. You're not, there's no in between. Is that right?
And part of that is because, let's think about, because there are things in which there's sort of gray areas, and either the light is on or it's off, right?
Right, yeah.
And there are areas in which it's not. When we think of racist and anti-racist as opposites, let's take an idea. So you have a racist idea which suggests racial hierarchy, right? So a particular racial group is superior or inferior. What's the opposite of that? Racial equality, right? There's no in-between hierarchy and equality. And similarly, you have a policy, and you can measure, is this policy creating more equity or inequity? When it comes to those things, there's really no in-between.
You've written a number of books for children of varying ages, and your latest book, How to Be a Young Anti-Racist, was published, I think, just in the last 2 weeks. Can you tell us about that book?
Well, the book, How to Be a Young Anti-Racist, I wrote with Nick Stone, who's a bestselling young adult author. And what the book did is it was written in the second person with Nick as the narrator, writing to you, meaning me. And it really was a book that sort of told me my story, the ways in which I had internalized, particularly anti-Black racist ideas as a youngster, and how I was able to ultimately unlearn those ideas and strive to be anti-racist, and ultimately providing almost a guidepost for young people about what they can do to bring about racial justice. And it ends with me at 17 years old, sort of after hearing this story of what's going to happen to me in the future and what's happened to me in the past, realizing that I needed to change.
One of the really remarkable aspects of How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is the book on which the How to Be a Young Anti-Racist obviously is based, is that it is very much a spiritual autobiography, and it's very powerful to read how you discern lessons out of your own life experience. So I want to turn back to this book. It was published in 2019, and it gained immediate acclaim. But then in June of 2020, it reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, where it remained for a long while. People were perhaps looking for a primer on how to respond, not to what was new, certainly, but what was newly coming to light in ways that they hadn't seen it before. What does How to Be an Anti-Racist attempt to do? What is its mission?
So there are a number of different aspects of its mission, but I think to boil it down, it is to allow someone to understand the way racism operates in different facets in society, so they can understand it in all of its complexity, and then also understand the ways in which racist ideas may be operating in their own mind, preventing them from seeing all of that racism in all of its complexity. And then it also really attempts to, using my own personal journey, to allow someone to begin to unpack and rethink and consider ideas that they had consumed or believed over the course of their lifetime. Because the book is really, in many ways, a memoir of me, similar to the young adult edition, of my story of learning and unlearning racist ideas, of learning and guiding towards being anti-racist. And so the person is able to sort of see my journey. But it's hard to understand what it means to be anti-racist without understanding, obviously, the way racism operates in society and even in individuals.
You define race, and this is a quote, as a power construct of collected or merged difference that lives socially. Can you unpack that definition?
Yeah, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
So let me actually share a story, which I think reveals this. So in the mid 1400s, Sorry, I'm an historian. Prince Henry the Navigator pioneered what ultimately became the transatlantic slave trade, in which Portuguese sailors left the coast of Europe and ventured into sub-Saharan Africa and brought enslaved people back to Portugal to go around the sort of Muslim middlemen and women who were essentially, they were receiving sub-Saharan Africans for hundreds of years. And so he's pioneered this transatlantic slave trade, and the Portuguese, distinguishing them from other human traders in Europe, they started to specialize in the human trading of African people. And so by about the 1450s, a royal chronicler by the name of decided to write a biography of Prince Henry's sort of slave trading in Africa. And in this biography, he described the different skin colors of the people that the Portuguese had captured and brought back to Portugal. He described the different cultures, the different ethnicities. There was a tremendous amount of difference in the people. But what he attempted to do was to essentially justify the slave trading of African people. And the way he attempted to do that was to essentially combine all these different looking people with different backgrounds and different ethnicities into one people worthy of enslavement. And so that was really the construction of the, quote, black race. And it was constructed by a very powerful force. But then it started to live socially, because once this construct that there was these black people of different skin colors and ethnicities and nationalities, it started to sort of live socially. So then people started to believe it, and it passed on and still lives today.
A power construct of collected or merged difference that lives socially. I want to preface this next question with some of my own reflections.
Can I say one?
Yeah.
So I was like, I don't know why the name of the royal chronicler was escaping me. His name is Gomez Zerara. Sorry.
And that's why
it's like beating me up because I couldn't remember.
That's why you changed your middle name from Henry, right? It was from him.
That was one of the reasons, yes.
I remember. Okay, so I want to just begin this next question with a reflection of my own, because I learned about anti-Semitism from reading your book about racism. I used to believe that the roots of anti-Semitism could best be understood the same way I thought the roots of racism could best be understood, specifically as a fear or hatred of the other and a failure to see our common humanity. That's what I thought about anti-Semitism. It's what I thought about racism. But I've come to question that understanding, and I certainly now recognize that each phenomenon needs to be understood through the lens of its own history. One of your most intriguing theses turns, I think, the common understanding of racism on its head, arguing that racist ideas don't arise from ignorance and hatred, but rather are produced to justify racist policies, from slavery to Jim Crow to redlining. And one of your core arguments seems to be, and this is a quote from the book, that the consistent function of racist ideas is to manipulate us into seeing people as the problem instead of the policies that ensnare them. Can you talk a bit about that and what it means for a strategy to confront racism?
Sure. So first, let me just speak very briefly about the thesis itself, using the story I just told.
Yeah.
So in the case of the Portuguese deciding to exclusively engage in the human trading of what became African people, that was in many ways the first racist policy. But then they had to justify why they were exclusively trading in African people, particularly before the Pope. So this is the mid-1400s. And so then that justification became that these are beastly people. And Gomez-Zurara claimed that they were seeking to capture these people and bring them to Portugal and to God. So that they didn't make the case, Gomez-Zurara did not argue that they were capturing and trading these people to make money. He argued they were capturing these barbaric people to civilize them, particularly into Christianity. So what happened is the policy came first, then the ideas justified the policy. And then, as you would imagine, by the 1500s, you had the French, the Dutch, and the British who started engaging in human trading of African people, and then they were told, or I should say, they learned about African people from the Portuguese. And so for them, they almost started consuming, and those ideas about these people being beastly started to spread. And then so what happened then is people consumed those ideas and became hateful and ignorant towards, in this case, what later became black people. Or to take a more contemporary example, there are certain elected officials who recognize in their districts that because of the ideology of their constituents or even the demographics of their constituents, that they no longer have enough votes to win. So what they typically do, if they don't believe in democracy, is figure out new ways to suppress the votes of their political opponents. And that's happening all over the country as we speak. But you have to justify why you're seeking to pass a new voter suppression bill. So the way they're justifying it today is by saying there's widespread voter fraud in Atlanta, in Philadelphia, in Milwaukee, in Detroit, in cities with large black and brown populations. So they're essentially saying those black and brown voters are fraudulent and we need election security. So then people consume those ideas. And then we've had cases in which people actually go with arms to election sites where black and brown people are voting and obviously carrying out their hate. But in the case of the quote, when you have a disparity in this country, white median wealth is about 10 times black median wealth in this country. There's only two explanations for that. Either it's because there is something wrong with black people, in other words, or right about white people. In other words, black people aren't saving, they're not making good investments, there's something behaviorally or even culturally wrong with black people, or it's because of racist policies, historically and currently. And so if you believe that, let's say, black people are not fiscally wise, which is a racist idea, then you're going to look out at that massive racial wealth gap and not see a problem. So the racist ideas will distract you from the policies that are the true source of that racial wealth gap.
Okay, thank you. You write, and this is another quote, "The most threatening racist movement is not the alt-right's unlikely drive for a white ethno-state, but the regular American's drive for a race-neutral one." What is wrong with what you call this post-racial strategy of integration?
Sure. So from my estimation, post-racial theory is quite possibly the most sophisticated body of racist ideas that have ever been created. And so I've through my work, I've really tracked the history and development and reproduction of racist ideas. And what makes post-racial theory especially sophisticated and pernicious is what happens historically is people would produce ideas about Latinx people, about Native people, about Black people, about a particular racial group of people. What's happening now with post-racial theory is there isn't a widespread production and circulation of outwardly racist ideas about particular racial groups. Instead, what's happening is there's this consistent statement that racism doesn't exist. And what happens is, again, if you believe that racism doesn't exist in a society where Black people are disproportionately poor, they're disproportionately incarcerated, they're disproportionately being killed by police, they're disproportionately houseless, they're disproportionately food insecure, they're more likely to die from cancer and heart disease, and on and on. If you believe that racism doesn't exist, then what that means is racism can't be a cause of those racial inequities. So then what happens is you then develop your own racist ideas about those racial groups to explain the racial inequities you see. So that's much more sophisticated because then every individual has a unique set of ideas to explain the inequality that they see, which is much more difficult than if somebody's force-feeding you those ideas, because then we can track that and potentially disrupt them. Does that make sense?
It does. Too clearly. I want to turn to some current events because there's certainly plenty to talk about. In the book, you write about the relationship between police and the Black community, addressing a number of tragedies at the hands of white officers and also a few at the hands of Black officers. How would you describe the role of race in Tyre Nichols' tragic death, and how would you evaluate the response of the city of Memphis and its police department?
Well, first, I think that when we are considering whether race or racism was a factor, we too often focus our viewpoint on the perpetrator as opposed to the victim. Just as we put a lot of focus on the intent of the policymaker or even the language in an actual policy, and less focus on the outcome of a policy. So as a student of racism, I've been long arguing that our focus needs to be on the victims and our focus needs to be on the outcome. So when we assess what happened in Memphis, the question isn't what the race of the officers were. The question is, would those officers have brutalized that person if they were not Black or if they were white? And I think it's pretty safe to say, I think it's a pretty good estimate or guess to state that if Tyre Nichols was white, he'd still be with us. And so that's what ultimately makes it a form of racist violence. Now, I think in terms of the response of the city, obviously, I think the swiftness in which those officers were fired and charges were brought against them, certainly I can't quibble with that. The biggest thing that there are a number of different issues, but one thing I want to point out is the police chief, one of her signature initiatives was to create the Scorpion Unit. And so part of what's happening here is, the politics are pretty obvious, right? You come in, you create the Scorpion Unit, you champion it, then it leads to this pretty significant, brutal beating. So now you're trying to cover your tracks by quickly firing them and quickly shutting down the Scorpion Unit. So it's gonna, I don't know how high this goes, but to me, there's a lot more people that need to be fired and charged.
The College Board. According to reports in the press, and I've tried to keep up with it, but I may not have the latest. According to reports in the press, the College Board recently removed material from its advanced placement course in African American Studies. Certain authors addressing black feminism and the queer experience, writers you admire like Kimberly Crenshaw, and experiences you identify as essential to acknowledge in the fight against racism have been cut from the formal curriculum, and other topics like the Black Lives Matter movement and incarceration have been shifted from required to optional. At least that's the latest that I've read. Do you have any updates as to where things stand and what is your reaction to this?
I don't have any further updates.
Okay.
But my reaction to it is, first, let me just express the context of what's happening. So throughout, whether it's been Negro studies or ultimately we became African American studies, whether we're talking about Negro history or even ultimately what's now African American history, many of the pioneers of these fields centered men and the story of black men. And so one of the major interventions of black feminism was to say, well, not all black people are men, right? And how can we have this dual center, or how can we tell the story of the United States, or even tell the story of African Americans from the perspective of black women? Similarly, the Negro history, African American studies, the pioneers typically centered heterosexual cisgender people. And so apparently queer folks who are black don't exist. So what black queer theory stated is, no, you have to have a multiplicity and diversity of experiences and thoughts within black studies and within African American history. So for Florida to insist and the College Board to agree that black feminist thought and black queer theory should be removed, what's the end point of that? What they're ultimately saying is we should be centering the history of black men and black heterosexual cisgender people, which to me is not reflective of the entirety of the African American experience.
Do you think that there will be any shift back by the College Board to try to reclaim some of this material? It seems to be ongoing.
I wish the College Board cared more about education than its own profits.
Okay. I want to, as I said, I learned a bit about my own thinking about anti-Semitism from reading the book. And I want to ask you a question about anti-Semitism for a moment. You've spoken out about the rise in anti-Semitic violence and rhetoric, including after events last fall, when you retweeted a Washington Post article calling anti-Semitism not simply an interreligious issue, but a dangerous form of racism. Can you explain why we should view anti-Semitism that way?
Well, I mean, if you think about it from the standpoint of, I talked earlier about white supremacist thought.
Yeah.
And so typically, white supremacists frame Jewish people as a separate race. They racialize Jewish people. And whenever you racialize a particular group, demonize that group, and obviously engage in violence towards that group, obviously that's a form, of racism. And so I just think it's consistent with what people are actually facing and what's actually happening in our society. And I think it also allows people to begin to understand the ways in which even racialization itself, over the course of history, has been so varied, right? I mean, people have a very narrow view about racialization, And I think it's important for us to have a more expansive view of racialization, just as it's important for us to have a more expansive view of racism in its many forms, affecting different groups of people.
Okay, thank you. I want to ask a couple of questions, just a few more with which to end, by talking about this moment and the future. And first, to ask you these two questions. Do you think we are at an inflection point regarding race in America? And is there any reason to be hopeful that we can become a more anti-racist society? Because the book does have a note of hope in it.
So I actually do think we're in an inflection point, and I think, I don't think it's a coincidence that there has just been an incredible rise in obviously anti-Semitic violence and other forms of racist violence, over the course of the last few years. I don't think it's a coincidence that white supremacist groups are organizing. I don't think it's a coincidence that white supremacists are claiming some of the highest positions. To me, part of the reason why this is happening, well, let me take a step back. What we've been told is the reason why this is happening is because of demographic shifts or the power or influence of particular groups of people. I actually don't think that fully explains it. What I actually think explains it is the march of anti-racism. And when you look at the history of the marches of anti-racism, it typically stoked is a horrible word. It typically, those who were seeking to conserve racism, those who were seeking to conserve policies that maintain inequity, those who benefited from us hating each other, who benefited from us thinking in hierarchical terms about different groups, those who benefited from us thinking that the source of our pain were those other people who worship differently or look differently than us. Like, once people start no longer being hoodwinked and manipulated by those racist ideas, those people who depended on those ideas for their power, they're going to respond in a very vicious way, trying in a new and even more vicious and more aggressive fashion to reconvince those people that anti-racism is the problem, trying to convince those people that those people of color are the problem, those Jews are the problem, which then, of course, creates even more violence. And I think, so I just don't want us to get lost by the fact that there are, let me give an example. In the summer of 2020, of course, people are very familiar with the fact that we had upwards of 25 million people demonstrating against racism and police violence across this country. It was the largest recorded uprising and series of demonstrations for any issue in American history. And one of the reasons for that was because a poll in June of 2020 found that 76% of Americans said that racism exists and is a huge problem. That was the highest percentage ever recorded. 51% of white Americans stated that racism exists and is a huge problem. The first time a majority of Americans, though slight majority, of white Americans recognized racism was a problem. And so by the end of the summer, there was this common recognition that racism, that bigotry more broadly, is an existential threat, that we need to get rid of it. So the way in which you undo that awareness is to say, no, actually, anti-racism is the real threat. It's to say anti-racism is anti-white. And people didn't necessarily know that that's an old white supremacist talking point. Those people who are for diversity and multiculturalism and anti-racism are the real racists. They're trying to divide us. That's an old white supremacist talking point. And I think that talking point is now mainstream.
I want to ask this last question. I was really moved by the words of your dissertation advisor. I want to make sure I'm pronouncing her name right. Professor Ama Mazama? Mazama. Ama Mazama. At Temple University. When she instructed you, quite simply, just tell the truth. If you could give us a simple instruction for what we can do, each of us, in our own daily interactions, to push America along the path of justice, what would that instruction, what would that advice be?
Well, I would first say that we each are living in a particular place. We each are potentially working in a particular institution. We each are operating within a particular sector or field of society. And chances are there are injustices, racial inequities, disparities in that specific place or in that specific field. And chances are there are actual organizations or groups of people who are trying to work to eliminate those disparities. And I think every single one of us could figure out a way to support those people. If we have a tremendous amount of time, we can volunteer our time. If we don't have much time, but we have money, we can donate to that. If we have a little bit of money and a little bit of time, we can do both. Or we can elevate their work. We can use our platforms to elevate their work. We can ask them, how can I be of service? And I'm mentioning that because I think sometimes this work seems too big, right? But if we're all focused in our own backyards, then we'll all be working in all of our backyards, right? The other thing I would state, and because I know you asked me in the previous question about, like, how do I remain hopeful, and I personally remain hopeful not because of what's happening in society or not happening. My hope remains because I don't know how I could fuel myself day in and day out if I did not believe change was possible. If I did not believe we could create an equitable, just society where none of us, because of our identity, has to fear walking down the street, where none of us, because of our identity, have to fear being excluded, where none of us, based on our identity, have to worry about how long we're going to live, I couldn't fuel myself every day if I believed that that was impossible. And so for me, I almost philosophically believe that change is possible. And I also draw on history and those times in which the impossible was done, to gain hope. And so I think everyone could probably draw from their own history. I think you can draw from Jewish history to find so many instances in which the impossible was achieved, particularly politically. And from African American history, people thought it was impossible chattel slavery would end. I mean, it had lived in this nation for 250 years. But my ancestors believed that the day of Jubilee could come. And they continued to resist, generation after generation, a resistance that was pivotal in a series of events that ultimately led to the Civil War, without getting into too much detail. But you're only going to resist if you believe there's an outcome to that resistance, right? That if you have some level of hope. And so if they can be hopeful, right? Why can't I be hopeful? If they can't fuel themselves to fight day in and day out, why can't I do that? And if they could believe that the richest and most powerful group of people in the world who were enslavers in 1860 could be defeated, then why can't I believe we can defeat and overcome the richest and most powerful people in the world today?
Dr. Kendi, thank you for your words and for your voice and for sharing them both with us tonight and for all God's work that you do in this world. Thank you all for being here. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.